Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairy Tales. If you've never been here before, thanks for checking us out. You're watching Varietal Literature's YouTube page, a cozy little corner of the internet for people who love narrative and in particular stories. And what we're doing tonight is we're reading old folklore and fairy tales, which is what we do every Tuesday night, except for around Christmas, which is a reminder that there will be none next week. If you are watching this live, there is a live chat right there that you can join in, talk to me about the stories, have questions or things that you're curious about, and talk to others who are already chatting there. Or if you're not watching this live, down in the description below, there will be timestamps. You can, pardon me. There will be timestamps down there where you can jump ahead to the beginning of whatever story interests you the most. We're going to read two stories tonight that both come from the same collection. They are more on the side of, well, the second one in particular is more on the side of a fairy tale than traditional folklore. And the first story is ostensibly folklore. It might have just been made up. Well, I mean, I guess depending on how you look at folklore. But what I mean is it might have been a single author. It's hard to say. Yeah. I see Uncle Kitty in the chat and Jumpstore in the chat. Jumpstore being cold. Yeah. I'm sorry that you're cold, Jumpstore. Put your feet up to the fire. Hopefully it'll warm up. Tammy having a rough day. I imagine that's still about your recovery. At least I hope new problems have not cemented themselves into your life. But nonetheless, I am sorry to hear that. Hopefully the tales take your mind off it. Okay. Well, I won't delay. If at all I can help it. All right, so the first story is a bit of a shorter story, ostensibly from Germany, ostensibly a folklore about the first Christmas tree. I mean, obviously, it's not a historical thing. This is not the actual tale of the first Christmas tree. I think most people know that, but in case people have stumbled in here expecting some sort of historical analysis, that's not what we're getting. We're getting a legend, time-constrained mythos, folklore, however you want to think about it. Anyhow, we're going to read that first. It's a shorter tale. And then we're going to read the second tale of the night called The Christmas Princess, which is longer than normal, and a more classic fairy tale, single author kind of thing. But it has one of the weirdest turns in it for the kind of story it is. Like, it goes along following its usual beats to the point where I'll even say the second act drags a bit. And then the third act just takes a hard left, slams you into a wall for a reason that I don't understand. And I was like, okay, well then I got to read this. So those are the two stories we're reading tonight, just stories about Christmas. They both come to us from a book called A Budget of Christmas Tales, which is a sort of collection of tales, short tales, abridged versions of stories, of novellas and so on, published probably sometime in the 19th century. I don't have its date right at hand. But it includes a bunch of works from Charles Dickens. I have actually read from this book before, but it's been at least 3 years since I did it. And it is a collection of like some folklore, but it's also a collection of it's a collection of some folklore and so on, but it's also a collection of individual author stories. So like it opens with Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, sort of an abridged version. If you want to read it yourself, again, it's called A Budget of Christmas Tales by Charles Dickens and others. um, published by the Christian Herald, which you can find on Project Gutenberg, for free. I see Sukima GS are also in the chat now. Good to see you folks. Let's get to the story. Now, our first tale takes place in a house around winter, little cabin. So let's put ourselves in a little house. Our first tale of the night is called The Legend of the Christmas Tree, and it comes to us from a budget of Christmas tales by Charles Dickens and others, a collection of novellas, abridged novellas, short stories, and so on from authors, and some folklore in this case, that has no specific attribution. Most children have seen a Christmas tree, and many know that the pretty and pleasant custom of hanging gifts on its boughs comes from Germany. Again, I'm not really sure that's true. These sort of tales, take them with a grain of salt. But perhaps few have heard or read the story that is told to little German children respecting the origin of this custom. The story is called The Little Stranger and runs thus. In a small cottage on the borders of a forest lived a poor laborer who gained a scanty living by cutting wood. He had a wife, 2 children, and they helped him with his work. The boy's name was Valentine, and the girl was called Mary. They were obedient, good children, and a great comfort to their parents. But, of course, one winter evening, this happy little family were sitting quietly round the hearth. The snow and the wind raging outside. Can you hear it? I can. Well, they ate their supper of dry bread when a gentle tap was heard on the window. And a childish voice cried out from without, "Oh, let me in, pray. I'm a poor little child with nothing to eat and no home to go to, and I shall die of cold and hunger unless you let me in." Valentine and Mary jumped up from the table and ran to the door, saying, "Come in, poor little child. We've not much to give you, but whatever we have, we will share with you." And so she came in. And the stranger child came in, warmed his frozen hands and feet at the fire, and the children gave him the best they had to eat, saying, "You must be tired too, poor child. Lie down on our bed. We can sleep on the bench for just one night." And then said the little stranger child, "Thank God for all your kindness to me." So they took their little guest into their sleeping room and laid him on the bed, covered him over, and said to each other, "How thankful we ought to be. We have rooms and a cozy bed, while this poor child has only heaven for his roof and the cold earth for his sleeping place." When their father and mother went to bed, Mary and Valentine lay quite contentedly on the bench near the fire, saying before they fell asleep, "The stranger child will be so happy tonight in his warm bed." Well, these kind children had not slept in many hours before Mary awoke and softly whispered to her brother, "Valentine, dear, wake, listen to the sweet music under the window." Then Valentine rubbed his eyes and listened, and it was sweet music indeed. It sounded like beautiful voices singing to the tones of a harp. "O holy child, we greet thee, bringing sweet strains of harp to aid our singing." I don't actually know what the melody is here. "O thou, holy child, in peace art sleeping, while we war Well, we are watch without our keeping. I think we were testing the limits of the language with that. Blessed be the house wherein thou liest, happiest on earth, to heaven the highest. The children listened, and well a solemn joy filled their hearts. Then they stepped softly to the window to see who might be without. And in the east was a streak of rosy dawn, and in its light they saw a group of children standing before the house, clothed in silver garments, holding golden harps in their hands. Amazed at this sight, the children were still gazing out of the window when a light tap caused them to turn round, and there stood the stranger child before them, clad in a golden dress, and with gleaming radiance round his curling hair. "I am the little Christ child," he said, "who wanders through the world, bringing peace and happiness to good children. You took me in and cared for me when you thought me a poor child, and now you shall have my blessing for what you have done." A fir tree grew near the house, and from this he broke a twig, which he planted in the ground, saying, "This twig shall become a tree, and shall bring forth fruit year by year for you." No sooner had he done this than he vanished, and with him the little choir of angels. But the fir branch grew, became a Christmas tree, and on its branches hung golden apples and silver nuts every Christmas tide, even though it's a fir tree. Don't think about it too much. No sooner... Oh, such is the story told to German children concerning their beautiful Christmas trees. Though we know that the real little Christ child can never be wandering cold and homeless again in our world, inasmuch as he is safe in heaven by his Father's side. Such a weird side note. Yet we may gather from this story the same truth which the Bible plainly tells us, that anyone who helps a Christian child in distress... Christian child. How about just a child? In distress, it will be counted unto him as if he had indeed done it unto Christ himself. Inasmuch as ye have done it unto the least of these, my brethren, ye have done it unto me. Uncle Kitty says, these people should immediately ask, are you undead or fae? Unfortunately, nothing quite that wacky. I didn't have time to ask Jürgen whether he's ever heard this one before, but I wouldn't find it hard to believe that it made some rounds in the countryside. Germany has a lot of little legends like this, although it is more provincial with its storytelling than people might originally know. I mean, regular viewers know. But it is an interesting idea that it's a replication of a magical fir tree given by Jesus when a family was nice to him. I wouldn't say it's the most elegant storytelling, but it is unexpected. Jumpstore says, is it weird that I'm complaining about being cold while eating gelato? No, I have several friends who do this. They'll be like, can we turn the heat up as they eat ice cream? No. Okay. Sorry, I forgot to mute there. All right. Let's get to our second and last tale. Sugima said, I heard the first Christmas trees were found in France in the 1500s. Yeah, I'd believe that. I mean, I I'm just fairly certain it's not. The first Christmas tree wasn't a Jesus blessed fir that had golden apples on it. Like, whatever may be the case, I don't know. I've seen a lot of theories around Christmas trees. Some of them are pretty far reaching. I won't specify in case that's like somebody's pet theory in the chat, but some of them I think are really trying pretty hard to push a certain idea of where a lot of Christmas traditions came from. I think ultimately, if I had to guess, it probably doesn't really have a very stable origin. I think it's probably just one of those things where you have trees around and you put pretty things on it because it's something to do. Like, I don't know if it's going to be much more than that. All right. Our second story of the night is called The Christmas Princess. And it is by someone called Mrs. Molesworth, which, I'll be honest, I don't know if that's a real name. It doesn't feel like a real name. It might have been a pen name of an author of this era. So lots of reasons why a lot of authors for children's books went by pen names. But maybe there is somebody called Mrs. Molesworth, because it sounds to me like something from like a modern fantasy novel. But I think that might be because a lot of modern fantasy uses kind of old style naming. So who knows? Maybe it's a real name. Anyways, our second story is called The Christmas Princess, and it is by someone named Mrs. Molesworth. It comes to us again from a budget of Christmas tales by Charles Dickens and others, in this case Molesworth. It is a longer tale. It is a fairy tale. And despite the fact that for the first two acts you have a pretty good sense of where it's going, the third act narratively goes where you think it's going to go. But how it gets there is very bizarre. Yeah. In the olden times, there lived a king who was worthy of the name. He loved his people, and his people loved him in return. His kingdom must have been large, at least it appears to be beyond doubt that it extended a good way in different directions, for it was called the Kingdom of the Four Orts, which, of course, as everybody knows, means that he had possessions of north, south, east, and west. What fool wouldn't have known that? It was not so large, however, but that he was able to manage it well for himself, that is to say, with certain help, which I will tell you of. A year never passed without his visiting every part of his dominion and inquiring for himself into the affairs of his subjects. Perhaps, who can say, the world was not so big in those days. Doubtless, however, that may have been, there were not so many folk living in it. Many things were different in those times. Many things existed which nowadays would be thought strange and incredible. Human beings knew much more than they do now about the dwellers on the earth. For instance, it was no uncommon case to find learned men who were able to converse with animals quite as well with each other. Fairies, of course, were often visible to mortal eyes, and it was considered quite natural that they should interfere for good, sometimes perhaps for evil. As to that I cannot say, in human affairs. And good King Braveheart was especially favored in this way, for the help which, as I said, was in his governing of the people, was that of four very wise counselors indeed, the four fairies of the north and the south, and the east and the west. Pardon me, I just need to do something quick with my sound. These sisters were very beautiful as well as very wise, the four fairies of the compass. Though older than the world itself, they always looked young. They were, very much attached to each other, though they seldom met. Oh, you don't hear music. Let me make sure that that is fixed then. How about now? Folks, let me know if you're hearing music. It's showing up as coming through. These sisters were very beautiful as well as very wise. Though older than the world itself, they always looked young. They were very much attached to each other, though they seldom met. Still no music? Oh, it just was quiet. Okay, that's probably too loud now. Pardon me. Let's read this sentence again. These sisters were very beautiful as well as very wise. Though older than the world itself, they always looked young. They were very much attached to each other, though they seldom met, and it must be confessed that sometimes on such occasions there were stormy scenes, though they made it up afterwards, and the advice they gave was always to be relied upon. Now King Braveheart was married. His wife was young and charming and devotedly fond of him, but she was of a rather jealous and exacting disposition, and she had been much spoiled in her youth at her own home. She was sweet and loving, however, which makes up for a good deal, and always ready to take part in any scheme for the good of their people, provided it did not separate her from her husband. They had no children, though they had been married for some years, but at last came the hope of an heir. The queen's delight was unbounded, nor was the king's joy less than hers. It was late autumn, or almost winter, when a great trouble befell the pretty queen. The weather had grown suddenly cold, and a few snowflakes had fallen before their time. But Queen Clarabelle only clapped her hands at the sight, for with the winter she hoped the baby would come, and she welcomed signs of its approach on this account. The king, however, looked grave, and when the next morning the ground was all white, the trees and bushes covered with silvery foliage, he looked graver still. "Something is amiss," he said. "The fairies of the north must be on her way, and it is not yet time for her visit." And that very afternoon the snow fell again more heavily than before, and the frost wind whistled down the chimneys and burst open the doors and windows, and all the palace servants went hurrying and scurrying about to make great fires and hang up thick curtains. And get everything in order for the cold season, which they had not expected so soon. "It will not last," said the king quietly. "In a few days there will be milder weather again." But nevertheless, he still looked grave. And again the next morning, as he was sitting with the queen, who was beginning to feel a little frightened at the continuance of the storm, the double doors of her boudoir suddenly flew open, and an icy blast filled the room, and a tall, white-shrouded figure stood before them. "I have come to fetch you, brave heart," she said abruptly. "You are wanted, sorely wanted in my part of the world. The people are starving. The season has been a poor one, and there has been bad faith. For new, powerful men have bought up the grain, which was already scarce, refused to let the poor folk have it. Nothing will save their lives or prevent sad suffering but your own immediate presence. Are you ready? You must have seen I was coming." She threw off her mantle as she spoke and sank onto a couch. Strong as she was, she seemed tired with the rate at which she'd traveled. The warm air of the room was oppressive to her. Her clear, beautiful features looked harassed, her gray eyes full of anxiety. For the moment, she took no notice of the queen. "Are you ready?" she repeated. "Yes, I am ready," said Braveheart as he rose to his feet. But the queen threw herself upon him with bitter crying and reproaches. Would he leave her? And at such a time, a prey to all kinds of terrible anxiety. And then she turned to the fairy and upbraided her in unmeasured language. But the spirit of the north glanced at her with a calm pity. "Poor child," she said, "I had almost forgotten you. The sights I've seen of late have been so terrible that they absorb me. Take courage, Clarabelle. Show yourself a queen. Think of the suffering mothers and their little ones whom your husband hastens to aid. All will be well with you. Believe me, but you too must be brave and unselfish." It was no use. All she said but made the queen more indignant. She would scarcely bid her husband farewell. She turned her back to the fairy with undignified petulance. "Foolish child," said the northern spirit. "She will learn better some day." Then she gave all her attention to the matter which she had come about, explaining to the king that they journeyed exactly the measures he must take and the difficulties to be overcome. But though the king had the greatest faith in her advice, and never doubted that it was his duty to obey, his heart was sore, as you can understand. Things turned out as he had said. The severe weather disappeared again as if by magic, and some weeks of unusually mild days followed, and when the winter did set in for good at last, it was with no great rigor. From time to time news reached the palace of the king's welfare, and the tidings were cheering. His presence was effecting all that the fairy had hoped, so Queen Clarabelle ought to have been happy. But she was determined not to be. She did nothing but cry and abuse the fairy, declaring that she would never see her dear Braveheart again, and that if ever her baby came, she was sure it would not live, or that there would be something dreadful the matter with it. "It is not fair," she kept saying. "It is a shame that I should suffer so." And even when on Christmas Eve a beautiful little girl was born, as pretty and lively and healthy as could be wished, and even through the next day brought the announcement of the king's immediate return, Clarabelle still nursed not just a baby, but her resentment. Though in the end it came to be directed entirely against the northern fairy. For when she saw Braveheart again, his tender affection and his delight in his little daughter made it impossible for her not to forgive him, as she expressed it. though she could not take any interest in his accounts of his visit to the north and all he had been able to do there. A great feast was arranged in the honor of the christening of the little princess. All the grand people of the neighborhood were bidden to it, nor, you may be sure, did the good king forget the poorer folk. The 4 fairies were invited. It was a matter of course that they should be the baby's godmothers, and though the queen would gladly have excluded the northern fairy, she dared not even hint at such a thing. But she resolved in her own mind, in her power, to show that she was not the welcome fairy. On such occasions when human beings were honored by the presence of fairy visitors, these distinguished guests were given, naturally, precedence over all the others. Otherwise, very certainly, they would have never come again. Even among fairies themselves, there are ranks and formalities, and the queen well knew that the first place was due to the northern spirit. But she gave instructions that this rule should be departed from, and the snow fairy, as she was sometimes called, found herself placed at the king's left hand, separated from him by her sister of the west, instead of next to him on the right, which seat, on the contrary, was occupied by the fairy of the south. And she glanced round her calmly, but took no notice, and the king, imagining that by her own choice, perhaps, she had chosen the unusual position, made no remark. And the feast progressed with the accustomed splendor and rejoicing. But at the end, when the moment arrived at which the 4 godmothers were expected to state their gifts to the baby, the queen's spite could no longer be concealed. "I request," she exclaimed, "that for reasons well known to herself, to the king, and to myself, the northern fairy gift may be the last instead of the first." Well, the king started and grew pale. The beautiful, soft-voiced fairy of the south, in her glowing golden draperies, would fain have held back, for her affection for her sterner sister was largely mingled with awe. But the snow fairy signed to her imperiously to speak. "I bestow upon the princess sweetheart," she said, half tremblingly, "the great gift of great beauty. And I, the spirit of the east, who came next, her red robes falling majestically around her, her dark hair lying smoothly in its thick masses on her broad, low forehead, I give her great powers of intellect and intelligence." "And I," said the western fairy with a bright, breezy flutter of her sea-green garments, "health, perfect health, and strength of body is my gift to the pretty child." "And you," said the queen bitterly, "you cold-hearted fairy, who've done your best to kill me with misery, who came between my husband and me, making him neglect me as he never would have done but for your influence, what will you give my child? Will you do something to make amends for the suffering you've caused? I'd rather my pretty baby were dead than that she lived to endure what I have of late endured." "Life and death are not mine to bestow or to withhold," said the northern spirit calmly. as she drew her white garments more closely around her with a majestic air. "So your rash words, foolish woman, fortunately for you all, cannot touch the child, but something much I can do, and I will. She shall not know the suffering you dread for her with so cowardly a fear. She shall be what you choose to fancy I am, and instead of the name you have given her, she shall be known for what she is. Princess Iceheart." And she turned to go. But the king on one hand and her 3 sisters on the other started forward to detain her. "Have pity," explained the former. "Sister, bethink you," said the latter, the western fairy adding beseechingly, with the tears springing in her blue eyes, which so quickly changed from bright to sad. "Say something to soften this hard fate. Undo it you cannot, I know, or at least allow me to mitigate it if I can." The snow fairy stopped. In truth, she was far from hard-hearted or remorseless. She already was beginning to feel half sorry for what she'd done. "What would you propose?" she said coldly, and the fairy of the west threw back her auburn hair with a gesture of impatience. "I would I knew," she said. "'Tis a hard knot that you've tied, my sister, for that which would mend the evil wrought seems to me impossible while the evil exists. The cure and the cessation of the disease are one. How could the heart of ice be melted till tender feelings warm it? And how can tender feelings find entrance into a feelingless heart? Ah! Alas, alas, I can but predict what sounds like a mockery of your trouble." She went on, turning to the king, though indeed by this time she might have included the queen in her sympathy, for Claribel stood, horrified at the result of her mad resentment, as pale as Braveheart himself. "Hearken," she said, her expressive face, over which sunshine and showers were wont to chase each other as on an April day, for such as all know is the nature of the changeful, lovable spirit of the West, for once grew still and statue-like while her blue eyes pierced far into the distance. "The day on which the princess of the icy heart shall shed a tear, that heart shall melt, but then only." The northern fairy murmured something under her breath, but what the words were no one heard, for it was not many that dared stand near to her, so terribly cold was her presence. The graceful spirit of the south fluttered her golden locks, and with a little sigh drew her radiant mantle around her and kissed her hand in farewell, while the thoughtful-eyed, mysterious eastern fairy linked her arm in that of her western sister and whispered that the solution of the problem should have her most earnest study. And the green-robed spirit tried to smile through her tears in farewell as she suffered herself to be led away. So the 4 strange guests departed, but their absence was not followed by the usual outburst of unconstrained festivity that a child's birth, especially one of the king, would have elicited. On the contrary, a sense of sorrow and dread hung over all who remained, and before long everyone, not immediately connected with the palace, respectfully but silently withdrew, leaving the king and queen to their mysterious sorrow. Claribel flew to the baby's cradle. The little princess was sleeping soundly, and she looked rosy and content, a picture of health. Her mother called eagerly to the king. "She seems just as usual," she exclaimed. Perhaps so after all I've done no harm." For, strange to say, her resentment against the northern fairy had died away. She now felt nothing but shame and regret for her own wild temper. "Perhaps," as she went on, "it was but to try me, to teach me a lesson, that the snow fairy uttered those terrible words. Braveheart pitied his wife deeply, but he shook his head. I dare not comfort you with any such hopes, he said. My poor Clarabelle. The fairy is true as steel. If you could but have trusted her, had you seen her as I have done, full of tenderest pity for suffering, you could never have so maligned her. Clarabelle did not answer, but her tears dropped on the baby's face. The little princess seemed annoyed by them. She put up her tiny hand and with a fretful expression brushed them off. And that very evening, the certainty came. The head nurse sent for the queen, and while she was undressing the child, the mother hastened to the nursery. The attendants were standing round in the greatest anxiety, for though the baby looked quite well otherwise, there was the strangest coldness over her left side, in the region of the heart. The skin looked perfectly colorless, and the soft cambric and still softer flannel of the finest, which had covered the spot, were stiffened, as if they'd been exposed to a winter night's frost. Alas, exclaimed Clarabelle, but that was all. It was no use sending for doctors, no use doing anything. Her own delicate hand, when she laid it on the baby's heart, was, as it were, blistered with cold. The next morning, she found it covered with chilblains. But the baby did not mind. She flourished amazingly. Heart or no heart, she was perfectly healthy, ate well, slept well, and soon gave signs of unusual intelligence. She was seldom put out, but when angry, she expressed her feelings by loud roars and screams, though with never a tear. At first this did not seem strange, as no infant sheds tears during the earliest weeks of its life. But when she grew to 6 months old, then to a year, then to 2 and 3, and was near her 4th birthday without ever crying, it became plain that the prediction was indeed to be fulfilled. And the name Iceheart clung to her, in spite of all her royal parents' commands to the contrary. Princess Iceheart, she was called, far and near. It seemed as if people could not help it. Sweetheart, we cannot name her, for sweet she is not, was murmured by all who came in contact with her. And it was true. Sweet she certainly was not. She was beautiful and healthy and intelligent, but she had no feeling. In some ways she gave little trouble. Her temper, though occasionally violent, was as a rule placid. She seemed contented in almost all circumstances. And when her good old nurse died, she remarked coolly that she hoped a new attendant would dress her hair more becomingly. When King Braveheart started on some of his distant journeys, she bade him goodbye with a smile, observing that if he never came home again, it would be rather amusing, as she would then reign instead of him. And when she saw her mother break into sobs at her unnatural speech, she stared at her in blank astonishment. And so things went on until Iceheart reached her 17th year. By the time she was, as regarded her outward appearance, as beautiful as the fondest of parents could desire, she was also exceedingly strong and healthy, and the powers of her mind were unusual. Her education had been carefully directed, and she'd learned with ease and interest. She could speak in several languages. Her paintings were worthy of admiration, as they were skillful and well executed. She could play with brilliancy on various instruments. She had also been taught to sing, but her voice was metallic and unpleasing. But she could discuss scientific and philosophical subjects with the sages of her father's kingdom like no one of them herself. And I will ask chat now. We're still a ways off, but what do you think is going to make her cry? Because I don't think I'm spoiling anything to say that obviously that's going to happen. And besides all this care bestowed upon her training, no stone had been left unturned in hopes of awakening in the unfortunate girl some affection or emotion. Every day the most soul-stirring poetry was read aloud to her, enacted before her. She was taken to visit the poor of the city in their pitiable homes, which is... Can you imagine? You guys look sad enough to break the curse on our queen. Keep looking pathetic. We're not going to do anything about it. She was encouraged to see sad sights from which most soft-hearted maidens would instinctively flee, but all was in vain. She would express interest and ask intelligent questions with calm, unmoved features and dry eyes. Even music from which much had been hoped was powerless to move her to aught but admiration of the performer's skill or curiosity as to the construction of their instruments. There was but one peculiarity about her, which sometimes, though they could not have explained why, seemed to Ice Heart's unhappy parents to hint at some shadowy hope. The sight of tears was evidently disagreeable to her. More certainly than anything else did the signs of weeping arouse one of her rare fits of anger. So much so that now and then for days together the poor queen dared not come near her child, and tears were to her a frequent relief from her lifelong regrets. So beautiful and wealthy and accomplished a maiden was naturally not without suitors, and from this direction too, at first, Queen Clarabelle trusted fondly that cure might come. If she could fall in love, she said the first time the idea struck her. My poor dear, replied the king, to see you must have eyes, to love you must have a heart. But a heart she has, persisted the mother. It is only, as it were, asleep, frozen, like the winter stream which bursts forth again ever into fresh life and movement with the awaking spring. So lovers were invited, and lovers came, and were made welcome by the dozen, lovers of every description, rich and poor, old and young, handsome and ugly, so long as they were of passable birth and fair character. King Braveheart was not too particular. In the forlorn hope that among them one unfortunate wight might arouse some sentiment in the lovely statue he desired to win, but all was in vain. Each prince or duke or simple knight, duly instructed in the sad case, did his best. One would try poetry, another his lute, a third sighs and appeals. A fourth, imagining he had made some way, would attempt the bold stroke of telling Ice Heart that unless she could respond to his adoration, he would drown himself. And she only smiled and begged him to allow her to witness the performance, as she had never seen anyone drown. So one by one, the troop of aspirants, some in disgust, some in strange fear, and some in annoyance, took their departure, preferring a more ordinary spouse than the bewitched though beautiful princess. And she saw them go with calmness, though in one or two cases she had replied to her parents that she had no objection to marry Prince so-and-so or Count such and another if they desired it. It'd be rather agreeable to have a husband if he gave her plenty of presents and did all she asked. Though a sighing and moaning lover, or a man who's always twiddling a fiddle or making verses, I could not stand, she would add contemptuously. So King Braveheart thought it best to try no such experiment, and in future no gentleman was allowed to present himself except with the understanding that he alone should succeed in making Princess Iceheart shed a tear, would be accepted as her betrothed. And this proclamation diminished at once the number of suitors. Indeed, after one or two candidates had failed, no more appeared. So well did it become to be known that the attempt was hopeless. And for more than a year, Princess Iceheart was left to herself, very much apparently to her satisfaction. But all this time, the Mystic Sisters were not idle or forgetful. Several of the aspirants to Iceheart's hand had been chosen by them and conveyed to the neighborhood of the palace by their intermediacy from remote islands. And among these, one of the few who had found some slight favor in the maiden's eyes was a special protege of the Western Fairy, the young and spirited Prince Franklin. He was not one of the sighing or sentimental order of swains. He was full of life and adventure and brightness, and his heart was warm and generous. He admired the beautiful girl, but he pitied her still more, and this pity was the real motive which made him yield to the fairy's proposal that he should try again. "You pleased the poor child," she said when she arrived one day at the prince's home to talk over her new idea. "You made her smile by liveliness and fun, for I was there when you little knew it. The girl has been overdosed with sentimentality, doleful strains. I believe we've been on the wrong track all this time." "What do you propose?" said Franklin gravely, for he could be serious when seriousness was called for. "She did not actually dislike me, but that is more than most that can be said. But that is the most that can be said. And however I may feel for her, however I may admire her beauty and intelligence, nothing would induce me to wed a bride who could not return my affection. Indeed, I could scarcely feel any for such a one." "Ah, no. I agree with you entirely," said the fairy. "But listen, my power is great in some ways. I am well versed in ordinary enchantment, and I am most willing to employ my utmost skill for my unfortunate goddaughter." She then unfolded to him her scheme, and obtained his consent to it. "Now is your time," she said in conclusion. "I hear on the best authority Iceheart is feeling rather dull and bored at present. It is some time since she had the variety of a new suitor, and she will welcome any distraction." And she proceeded to arrange all the details of her plan. So it came to pass that very shortly after the conversation I have related, there was great excitement in the capital city of the Kingdom of the Four Orcs. After an interval of more than a year, a new suitor had at length presented himself for the hand of the Princess Iceheart. Only the king and queen received the news with melancholic indifference. "He may try as the others have done," said Braveheart to the messenger, announcing the arrival of the stranger at the gates. "Accompanied..." Pardon me. Let me have a drink of water. Accompanied by a magnificent retinue. But it is useless, for the poor king was fast losing all hope of his daughter's case. He was growing aged and careworn before his time. "Does he know the terms attached to his acceptance?" "Yes." The messenger from the unknown candidate for the hand of the beautiful Iceheart had been expressly charged to say that the Prince Jocko was the newcomer's name, was fully informed as to all particulars and prepared to comply with the conditions. The princess's parents smiled somewhat bitterly. They had no hope, but still they could not forbid the attempt. "Prince Jocko?" said the king. "That's not a very prince-like name. However, it matters little." A few hours later, the royal pair and their daughter, with all their attendants, in a great state and ceremony, were awaiting... Oh, did it crash on me? Give me a second. There we go. And soon a blast of trumpets announced his approach. His retinue was indeed magnificent, horsemen in splendid uniforms, followed by a troop of white mules with black riders in gorgeous attire. Then musicians succeeded the prince's immediate attendants, defiled before the great marble steps in front of the palace, and at the summit of which the king with the queen and princess were seated in state. Iceheart clapped her hands. "'Tis a good show," she said, "but where's the prince?" As she said the word, the cortege halted. A litter with closely drawn curtains drew up at the foot of the steps. "Gracious!" exclaimed the princess. "I hope he's not a mollycoddle." But before there was time to say more, the curtains of the litter were drawn. Make your guesses in chat. What comes next? Aside, and in another moment an attendant lifted out its occupant, who forthwith proceeded to ascend the steps. The parents and their daughter stared at each other and gasped. Prince Jocko was neither more nor less than a monkey. But such a monkey as never had been seen before. He was more comical than words can express, and when at last he stood before them, bowed to the ground in a three-cornered hat in his hand, his sword sticking straight out behind me and his tail sweeping the ground, the effect was irresistible. King Braveheart turned his head aside, Queen Claribel smothered her face in her handkerchief, and Princess Iceheart opened her pretty mouth wide and forgot to close it again, and while a curious expression stole into her beautiful eyes. Was it a trick? No, Prince Jocko proceeded to speak. He laid his little brown paw on his heart and bowed again, coughed, sneezed, and finally began an oration. If his appearance was too funny, his words and gestures were 100 times more so. He rolled his eyes, he declaimed, he posed, he pirouetted like a miniature dancing master. His little cracked voice rose higher and higher and higher as his own fine words and expressions increased in eloquence. And at last a sound, which never before had been heard save faintly, made everyone start. The princess was laughing as if she could no longer contain herself, clearly ringing, clear merry laughter, which it did one's heart good to hear, and on she went, laughing ever still. She flung herself at her mother's feet, the tears rolling down her cheeks. "Oh, ma!" she exclaimed, "I never!" And then she went off again. But Prince Jocko suddenly grew silent. He stepped up to Iceheart and respectfully raising her hand to his lips, gazed earnestly, beseechingly into her face, his own keen, sharp eyes gradually growing larger and deeper in expression, till they assumed the pathetic, wistful look of appeal one often sees in those of a noble dog. "Ah, princess," he murmured, and Iceheart stopped laughing. She pressed her hand to her side. "Father, mother," she cried, help me, am I dying? What has happened to me?" And with a strange, long-drawn sigh, she sank fainting to the ground. So maybe. No. There was great excitement in the palace, hurrying to and fro, fetching of doctors, and much alarm. But when the princess had been carried indoors and laid on a couch, she soon revived, and who can describe the feelings of the king and queen when she turned to them with a smile such as they had never seen on her face before? "Dearest father, dearest mother," she said, "how I love you! Those strange warm drops that filled my eyes seem to have brought new life to me." And as the queen passed her arm around the maiden, she felt no chill of cold, such as used to thrill her with misery every time she embraced her child. "Sweetheart! Oh, my own sweetheart!" she whispered. And the princess whispered back, "Yes, Call me by that name always. All was rejoicing when the wonderful news of the miraculous cure spread through the palace and the city. But still the parents' hearts were sore, for was not the king's word pledged that his daughter should marry who had effected this happy change? And this was no other than Jocko, who was a monkey. Maybe a prince, but to their knowledge, just a monkey. And the prince had disappeared at the moment that Iceheart fainted, and now with his retinue he was encamped outside the walls. All sorts of ideas occurred to the king. I cannot break my word, he said, but we might try to persuade the little monster to release me from it. But the princess would not hear of this. No, she said, I owe him too deep a debt of gratitude to think of such a thing, and in his eyes I read more than I can put in words. No, dear father, you must summon him at once to be presented to our people as my affianced husband. I almost said financed for some reason. So again, the cortege of Prince Jocko made its way to the palace, and again the litter, with its closely drawn curtains, drew up at the marble steps, and Sweetheart stood pale but calm and smiling to welcome her ridiculous betrothed. But who is this that quickly mounts the stairs with firm and manly tread? I'm going to start describing my stride that way. It's a firm and manly tread. Sweetheart nearly swooned again. Jocko, she murmured. Where is Jocko? Why, this is Prince Franklin. Yes, dear child, said a bright voice beside her, and turning round, Sweetheart beheld the Western Fairy, who with her sisters had suddenly arrived. Yes, indeed, Franklin and no other. And the universal joy may be imagined. Even the grave fairy of the north smiled a little bit with pleasure and delight. And as she kissed her pretty goddaughter, she took the girl's hand and pressed it against her own heart. Never misjudge me, sweetheart, she whispered. Cold as I seem to those who have not courage to approach me closely, my heart, under my icy mantle, is as warm as is now your own. And so it was. Where can we get a better ending than the time-honored one? Franklin and Sweetheart were married and lived happily ever after, and who knows but what in the kingdom of the four Orts they are living happily still. If only we knew the way thither, we might see for ourselves if it is so. And there we go. That is the story of the Christmas Princess. You probably forgot that it was themed around Christmas, which is fair enough, but it starts in Christmas. It's a pretty classic fairy tale, though I don't remember many that involve the prince becoming a monkey. But I do like the idea of winning the girl over by not being a cloying, annoying person, but just being funny and joyful. I think that was a charming twist. Yeah, bravo, Mrs. Molesworth, or whatever her name was. Yeah, it definitely feels like a story that was written by a woman to me. Maybe people in chat can disagree, because sometimes these stories are written by women, and what they were male writers who just knew that fairy tales from women sold better, or at least were perceived differently anyways. But I get the impression, where the focus is in the story makes me think that. Anyways, I found it a charming tale. And of course, we are going to be back on Thursday. Thursday will be a last stream of the year. And we are going to be doing the floating bookshop, because it'll be a full year since we started that. And I hope you'll join me for that. And then I will see you in the new year after that. As for everybody in the chat, thank you so much for hanging out with us this evening. Uncle Kitty, GS, Jum Store, Tammy off in the background. I hope your night's going better. And Sukima, anybody else who might have dropped in and I forgot. Thank you very much for coming along and for watching these things this year. I'll keep the fire warm. You have yourself a good sleep.